Merci au chef régional Bénédicte, chef régional de l'Ontario. Thank you to Regional Chief Benedict, Ontario Regional Chief. Before we continue, the meeting is now called to order. And I will invite the National Chief, Cindy Woodhouse Nepinak, for the welcome.
Thank you. But before I begin, I want to take a moment to recognize my dear friend, our sister organization on the other side of the medicine line, I'll say. Our friend from Turtle Island, and we were talking this morning, and I said, we never created these borders, but Mark Macaro is here, our national chief from the other side. They call him president at the NCAI, and we're so thankful that you're here, that I'd asked him to come sit up here. I said, we never had borders, and we have to work together, because Turtle Island belongs to First Nations people from coast to coast to coast, including on the other side of the medicine line. So please rise, and we'd like to honor you in a good way. So thank you for being here. Thank you. Trump and Canada will not divide our people anywhere, no matter where we are. So thank you. We let you in. Customs let him in, he said. But you'll hear from him later today, and I'm going to ask that our assembly welcome him and make relations with our relatives more strongly. I know we always have, but we have to continue to build on that and build our relations with our relatives to the south. Anin Buju, we acknowledge that we are here in the unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. I want to acknowledge and I want to hold up our host drum, the Eagle River Singers, and thank Knowledge Keeper Chuck Hume and Dr. Gwen Point for opening this assembly in a good way. Chimigwech. We also recognize the Eagle staffs in the room and all the ceremonial items. And we acknowledge Chief Jean-Guy Waitak from Kitiganzi B. Anishinaabeg for welcoming us to his territory. We also lift up Regional Chiefs Abraham Benedict, Grand Chief Linda Basagay, and Chiefs from across Ontario for your ongoing leadership and your inspiration. Chief Benedict, I want to thank you for your wisdom and your advice at our national executive. We appreciate your leadership on water, on policing, and border, just to name a few, does it all. Your success as well, Chief Fiddler, in securing a Canada-Ontario agreement on long-term reform of the First Nations child welfare system is so inspiring to many of us. Looking back over the past year, it has been also an honor to stand with you and with all the Ontario chiefs at Queen's Park in June against Bill 5. As chiefs were battling at Queen's Park for our rights, many were also fighting wildfires at home. So we lift up the chiefs in Ontario and chiefs across the nation for stepping up this past summer and being on the front lines of fires. We're also thinking of the Ontario chiefs. I want to take a moment to recognize the late Chief Lorraine Kobanez. She was a dear friend for many of us in this room, a highly respected chief. She never stopped fighting for the rights and the health of the Nisatsuan Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3 territory. So we honor her. We were honored to attend her service last month in her community and to pay respects to her family. When we see so many women chiefs, getting elected across this country, we can't think of legendary, we think of legendary matriarchs like Chief Kobanez. So in her name today, please join me in lifting up all the women chiefs, and it's so great to see, so give them a round of applause. Thank you. Thank you. I think I heard Chief Linda DeBasagay out there somewhere, but we lift her up in a good way as well. Talking about Ontario chiefs, we also want to recognize the extraordinary efforts that the Northern Ontario First Nations to rescue a Norwegian tourist that went missing in the north this past summer, and the decency and their courage received international attention. It was all over the world. So we lift up the Anishinaabe Oski Nation and Fort Severn First Nation community members that participated in the search. And of course, we also lift up the Manitoba Chiefs in the north that unfortunately they had to locate his body on Hayes River. Together, though, those communities demonstrated that First Nations can be counted on during difficult times. And First Nations have always been there for this country, for Canada, during difficult times. And we see our veterans here today. We lift you up in a good way. Right from the creation of this country, from the War of 1812, 2 world wars, 2 Quebec referendums that try to split this country apart, Afghanistan, the pandemic, and now it's another one of those times. To the south, Canada is under threat from Trump, but we have allies. The President of the National Congress of American Indians is here with us today, so I'm really thankful, as we just alluded earlier, that Mark is also the chairman of the Pechanga Band. Is that, I say that correctly?
It's close.
Pechanga Band, yeah, in the United States, and so I'm so glad that you're here with us this week. While Trump threatens Canada from the south, threats of separation are also fueled by Alberta and Quebec politicians in the east and in the west. And all around us, climate change threatens our communities and our quality of life. In response, First Nations are leading the way. We are standing up for the environment to protect all Canadians, not just First Nations. Alberta and Quebec chiefs have been the most vocal opponents of provincial separatists. And First Nations have always stood shoulder to shoulder with Canadians against Trump's illegal tariffs. So we understand it's a critical and uncertain time in this country's history, because Canada is at a crossroads in its relationship with First Nations. Our rights are being threatened in new ways, but we are not afraid. Far from it. First Nations across this country are stronger than we have ever been. We have had to overcome great odds to protect our rights, our laws, our resources, and our waters. Our ancestors have fought on this land to protect our rights as peoples and as nations. When Parliament, our provincial legislatures, have dishonoured the Crown, we have fought in the colonial courts and we've won over and over again. Sadly, First Nations continue to be forced to keep fighting in court, and rightfully, we have kept winning. Nothing has been given to us and we are not going back. So I can't think of a better place to discuss the future of this country than at this Special Chiefs Assembly this week. I want to thank, of course, our AFN staff all over this room for bringing this together and putting this assembly together for each of us. We thank the media, record number that are here, and everyone streaming online across Canada for being with us. We have a lot to get to this week and many resolutions to discuss. The Prime Minister will also be here later today at 4 o'clock, I believe, to take your questions. Numerous federal ministers and members of Parliament from all political parties have been invited to attend this week, and we lift them up for their public service. These are not easy jobs, folks. They require sacrifice, they require time away from your family, something that our chiefs and our leaders in this room understand. So we thank them for attending today. A lot has happened since when we last gathered in September on Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg. One thing to highlight before we start relates to the historic $23 billion settlement that we negotiated with Prime Minister Trudeau in 2023 on discrimination in the First Nations Child and Family Services Program and Jordan's Principle. In July, we announced approximately 40,000 claims have been received since we opened the application portal in March. And shortly after, we confirmed that the first payments had started to roll. So today we're announcing that over 88,000 claims are in, and more than $265 million has been distributed to claimants. We want to again thank our representative plaintiffs for their leadership. They inspire us each and every day to keep making sure this rollout keeps moving in a good way. This is a significant achievement, but we know that thousands more First Nations people are still eligible in these first 2 classes. And while no amount of money can ever make up for the harms, that this compensation, it's an important acknowledgement of the discrimination that they suffered. So please join me in thanking them and the Settlement Implementation Committee. We are grateful for your leadership. Thank you so very much. Many of them are in this room. Since September's Assembly, we have been going non-stop, starting with the federal budget. The Finance Minister, for I think AFN's first time in history, will be here later this week on Thursday to answer questions. November's budget was the new government's first chance to build back some of the trust that was lost after the major projects Bill C-5 was rammed through Parliament in 20 days without consultation. Last month's budget was also an opportunity to demonstrate through deeds that First Nations voices matter to this new administration. I wish I was here to say that we accomplished that mission. Sadly, the 2025 federal budget represents a significant setback. To be fair, we do recognize some investments for housing. We welcome measures to expand the capacity of the First Nations Finance Authority, and we were pleased to confirm that the $47.8 billion we negotiated last year for long-term reform of the First Nations child and family child welfare system has been protected. And so we lift up Minister Galmasti for her support on these priorities and her leadership in protecting Indigenous services from a 15% cut. We fought hard for that, but it should not have been so difficult. When the best that we can say is that Indigenous services is only being cut by $2 to $3 billion, we know that there's a problem, especially when provincial transfers for health, for education, and social services have gone up by 5%. Sadly, instead of closing the gap between First Nations and Canadians, this budget makes things more difficult. November's budget was introduced on the first anniversary of the passing of one of our leaders, Justice Murray Sinclair. So I want to personally recognize his son, Nigan, for our recent discussion 2 weeks ago about his dad's teachings, and we lift up his families, his daughters. He's got strong daughters, and we feel his spirit here today. As a commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission investigating residential schools, Justice Sinclair famously said, "Education got us into this mess, and education will get us out." More than half of the Commission's calls to action were focused on education. To mark the 10th anniversary of the Commission's final report this month, December, we call on Canada to make generational budget investments in First Nations education, training, and languages, because Canada talked a lot about generational investments in the lead up to the budget. We agreed and suggest that the most effective way to secure the future success of First Nations children and our economy is to invest in education, because Canada's education system was used as a tool to try to erase our culture, take our language, and break our spirit. For the next generation, education must be a tool that empowers First Nations youth and uplifts our children. First Nations are the youngest demographic in this country, but half of our schools are overcrowded. 50% of First Nations' actual education needs remain unfunded. So what generational investments were included in the budget for First Nations education? That silence you hear sounded like Canada's response. Education is one example. Closing the discriminatory First Nations infrastructure gap is another. First Nations policing, the First Nations Procurement Authority, states of emergency that chiefs called all over the country were all ignored in this budget. Yet the government still says, "Trust us." Canada's promise to introduce First Nations clean water legislation this year is another example. And I lift up many people in this room that worked really hard on that. During the election, the government promised to reintroduce a clean water bill as quickly as possible if they were elected. So this week, we join with chiefs from coast to coast in calling on this government to honour their commitment and reintroduce the First Nations Clean Water Act this month. There is still time. Besides that, the federal budget and the Clean Water Act, policing and justice issues have been a key focus since September's Assembly. From program funding cuts and bail reform to hate crime legislation and the Indian Act, we have worked to make sure that First Nations voices are heard in Parliament on these important issues. And so we lift up the chiefs who have made presentations to members of Parliament and senators this fall. The centre of this work is the important policy resolutions chiefs co-develop and vote on here in this room. With the calls for justice and the AFN Justice Strategy that we released in June, many of the chiefs' resolutions promote positive change to our justice system. This means revitalizing First Nations laws and legal systems. It means reforming the Canadian criminal justice system, and it means prioritizing First Nations policing as an essential service in this country, just like it is everywhere else. So we join the chiefs in calling on the government to also introduce the First Nations policing legislation in this session of Parliament. As part of my duties over the summer, we were invited to visit prisoners at the Stony Mountain Penitentiary. And it was really difficult, but I'm glad that we went because we need to see how our people are treated there. The incarceration rates are so overwhelming, and we will be visiting a women's institution soon. But it was really tough to visit that jail. And I went right into Max, and everybody was scared that I was going into Max. And I said, I'm going to go and sit with our men that have been, through the systems that be, the oppression that's put upon them. And being in there I spent the day with them. I took them donuts because I would have took KFC chicken had I known, and I'm going to do that again. But my heart was with them, and I was going cell to cell, and the guards were freaked that I would go in. I said, those are our people. And sadly, I looked around. It was unfortunately most of our people. And some of them, they have to do their time, but at the same time, the inhumane treatment that I had seen was hurtful. And knowing that in previous governments, one of the prime ministers from the past, just took things away from them, basic things like air conditioner, so that they could swelter in heat all summer. These are the conditions that, our people are facing being incarcerated. So I left from there, it was really heavy, and I'm thankful to Creator above because he sent a couple of elders that invited me over, and they were able to pray with me. They didn't know that I was having a hard day that day after that. But, remember that and keep them in prayer this holiday season. I know that they have a lot to learn as well, but those are our people. In addition to the justice reform, we have called on Canada to finally end the Indian Act's discriminatory second-generation cutoff, to move away from the dehumanizing categories of 6-1s and 6-2s, and end the Crown's ability to determine who is an Indian. Our people are entitled to belong to our people, and they are entitled to rights according to First Nation laws. First Nations must be in control of our own membership. We know who our ancestors are. Justice for First Nations in 2025 means doing something about hate and violence as well, directed towards our people. Because the more successful First Nations become in this country, the more that we assert our rights, the more hate rises against us, especially for our women. In 2023, after 152 years of Manitoba being a province, yes, we elected our premier, who was First Nation, but we also elected at that same time 2 First Nations women, and I'm very proud of them. They were elected and, of course, appointed as cabinet ministers, and it was a historic moment. And we lift up Nahani Fontaine and Bernadette Smith. We're proud of you. But recently, they have both of their constituency offices have been firebombed. These are just 2 examples. Vandalism and this kind of violence against First Nations is just not acceptable. So we look forward to First Nations testifying in Parliament over the coming months on proposed hate crime legislation. It's got to stop, including towards residential school survivors. Justice, of course, for First Nations in 2025 also means the return of our artifacts from the Vatican. This week, we will provide an update on the next important steps to repatriate our relatives. As some of them will be returning in the coming days, our thoughts are with the elders, with the residential school survivors, and the leaders that have prayed and worked so hard to bring them home. Chiefs in this assembly, you directed through resolution to repatriate and work on our artifacts, and we've worked on that really hard this year, and they'll be coming home this Saturday. So we promise to honor their work. We promise to keep up the pressure to bring back the artifacts, and we will not rest until all return home. The Vatican's just one piece. There's many more out there around the world. And justice for First Nations in 2025 also means that Canada and the provinces actually live up to their obligation to respect our fundamental rights under the Charter and the United Nations Declaration. This has been in the news a lot with a recent announcement about big resource projects. On the weekend, we saw a national report on the Alberta-Canada MOU state categorically that the mantra of free, prior and informed consent from Indigenous communities is gone, as if First Nations rights can be wiped away with one federal-provincial MOU. It was difficult to watch BC and many First Nations excluded from these discussions, particularly on the Pacific Coast. So we lift up all chiefs impacted for their passion and for their leadership, regardless of their position. Chiefs, of course, have different views on development, and this is to be celebrated. I told the press that this morning, not feared or used against us as a wedge to try and divide us. The truth is that Canada can create all the MOUs, project offices, advisory groups that they want, but Chiefs are united. When it comes to approving large national projects on First Nations lands, there will not be getting around rights holders. That's another reason outstanding First Nations treaty rights must be reconciled before others, because Métis rights do not include rights over First Nations lands, territories, and resources. First Nations, with the exception of the Inuit, are the only true landowners of these traditional territories. We have governed these lands. We have governed these lands since time immemorial, prior to colonial borders. Our rights cannot be implemented and respected without us in substance and in process, and they cannot be respected after the fact. When Canada and the provinces tried to exclude First Nations from repatriating the Constitution in the early 1980s, we fought to ensure Section 35 was included to affirm our treaty and pre-existing inherent rights. Then First Nations were told that Section 35 was simply an empty box, that any rights we thought we have must be negotiated again through agreements. So again, we fought in Canada's court system and proved them wrong. There are now hundreds of court decisions affirming the strength of our constitutional rights. We raise this critical history because Canada, the province, and proponents developing these major projects must take First Nations rights seriously. Everyone should know by now that there is no cutting corners when it comes to protecting human health, vital watersheds, and the constitutional rights of First Nations people. Our ancestors have inhabited these protected territories long before colonial borders. First Nations lands hold vast deposits of critical minerals, forests, and fresh water supplies that sustain communities on both sides of the medicine line. With each day, more Canadians recognize that Canada's economy will not achieve its full potential until we have a strong First Nation economy. First Nations businesses already contribute over $50 billion each year to Canada's GDP. This represents a 50% increase over the previous decade. The rest of Canada only grew by 37% during the same period. Canada's gross domestic product is generated off lands, of First Nations lands and resources. Over $600 billion of projects are forecast to be launched on our traditional lands over the next decade. The potential benefits are in the trillions of dollars, but they won't advance without First Nation support. Until an appropriate development process is established and founded in free, prior, and informed consent, the Crown's constitutional legal obligations will not be met. This is the law, and it can't be wished away. So, Chiefs, we have a lot of work to do. The late Justice Murray Sinclair called on us to get up and do the work of reconciliation. He described the mountain to all of us and showed us all the path to reach the top. But Justice Sinclair also said it was up to us to climb that mountain. When he talked about us, he was not just referring only to our people. He was inviting all Canadians to do the climbing together. And that long climb rests with all of us now, everyone in this room, every parliamentarian that's here listening, every province that's also listening, and every Canadian. So no matter how much federal and provincial governments try to ignore and avoid First Nation rights, we must come back tomorrow and keep doing the work for our people. That is why we called for a First Ministers meeting on First Nations issues early in the new year. A reset is required in 2026 if we want to keep this country united. Premiers agreed it was time for a meeting with First Nations when we met in July, and now the ball is in Canada's court. In Justice Sinclair's name, we must keep imagining a world where all of us have medicines, food, equal access to education, and a safe place to live. Not just a few, but truly all of us. Justice Sinclair prepared us to speak about this dream many times to many different people, but most will doubt this is even possible. He told us to keep trying, keep dreaming, because we have been given the gift to do that. We have a lot of ground to cover, and we have a short time to do it. Chiefs, you work unbelievably hard, and you put yourselves on the line each day to help your communities, to help your families. As National Chief, it is my honour to be here, standing with you, to advance your priorities, and through it all, we will be here with you together, just as our elders and our ancestors wanted us to work together. By strengthening our relations united, we can do anything that we want. So I stand with you and thank you. Chimigwech, apachikachinim.